Good morning, all. Thank you for being here with us today. We'll be starting our public meeting of our beautiful Sunday, and welcome to everybody who's joined already. Renata, good to see you here. And we'll start with the text from our daily bread, from the Spirit Emmanuel, through our dear Francisco Cândido Xavier. Before I do start, I do want to remind us of our book club. We have it coming up on September 19th. As you can see there, it's from 3 to 5 p.m. It'll be online, so you can join us online through Skype. And the book is called Libertação in Portuguese. So we don't have an English version of it. And this book is from, again, Francisco Cândido Xavier through the Spirit, André Luiz, and it's quite a good book, and I do invite you all to join us. And so to start today, let's read a text from our daily bread. Text number 53, titled In Chains. And it's regarding a passage from Paul to FSS chapter 6, saying, For which I am an ambassador in chains, so that I may speak of him freely as I should. And Emmanuel interpretation is, in this passage we observe the apostle to the Gentiles making a statement that appears contradictory at first glance. Paul states that his condition is that of an emissary in chains, while at the same time declaring that it has happened so that he can serve the gospel as freely as needed. The great worker was addressing the followers at Ephesus, referring to his distressing situation as a prisoner of the Roman authorities. Nevertheless, because of this, and in light of his difficult testimony, his spirit was freer for the service that he had to render. This image is significant for those who wish for economic and financial independence, or for greater freedom in the world in order to exemplify the teachings of the gospel. There are many people who say that they are waiting for days of material abundance and earthly advantages in order to attend to Christian ideals. This, however, is nonsensical. Serving Jesus can happen everywhere. Paul, in chains, felt freer to preach the truth. Of course, not all disciples will have to experience such high peaks of testimony, but all, without distinction, bring along with them the saintly chains of their obligations in the home, at work, in their hourly routines, in the midst of society, and in their families. None, therefore, should try to break their chains erroneously, believing that they will be a candidate for a better position in the workshop of the Christ. Only our duties, correctly fulfilled, will confer us access to real freedom. Very good. So let us start with a little prayer. Closing our eyes, taking a deep breath, we embark on this quick journey of prayer. We ask our friend, our master, our brother, our model and guide, Christ, who has inspired so many hearts, including the one of Paul of Tarsus, who was able to, through his testimony, show us that we can. Show us that we can find the strength in love, and show that we can find freedom in the truth. We ask our Father to help us model ourselves through Jesus. Help us on our day-to-day lives, to embark on our change, to love more, to instill compassion within our hearts, so we can too become freer in the truth. So be it. So thank you all for being here. Thank you. Welcome Sonia. Welcome Eric. Great to see you here. Let me know if you have any issues with the technology. Through our live chat, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, please. We ask you that you participate if you want. And just going to start here. So we will be talking about self-awareness today. And this is, just try to, there you go. We will be talking about self-awareness, and this is the number 4 talk that we do. And we'll be chatting a little bit about suffering and also about spiritual healing and how self-awareness can help us through that. It is based on heavily on the SAFE guidelines to develop self-awareness from Alídio Sequeira Filho, again from that Spiritizar project from Brazil, from the state of Mato Grosso Spiritist Federation. And we will touch upon the Gospel of John, and we'll be heavily using 2 books from Joana de Angelis through the medium de Valdo Pereira Franco, called Self-Discovery and Seeking the Truth. So there's 2 books. None of these books, I used the Portuguese version, so I translated myself. So obviously there is some interpretation there, so I apologize of any misinterpretation, but we'll talk about it. And so this is a series of lectures, 6 actually, and today we're reaching our 4th one that talks about spiritual health, overcoming pain and suffering, with the objective of today is to reflect about pain, especially about suffering and what is suffering, and how self-awareness can help us with that, and how can we promote our spiritual health through it. As we always do, we'll start with an initial reflection. So I invite you all to think about a couple of questions. First one is, have I been given much thought to self-awareness? We've been talking about self-awareness for 3 talks already, and I was wondering, have I given much thought to self-awareness? Do I know what it is? Do I know why it's something that could be very beneficial to us? And then the second one is, can I identify suffering in my life or in different areas of my life? And then the last one is, how could I help, how could self-awareness help me ease my suffering? Right? Ease as in diminishing it, dissolving it. Right? So I always start all of these 6 talks, I start with the same slide, just in case there's somebody new. And it's always talking about the point of self-awareness, right? Why even bother with self-awareness? Why is it such an important thing to talk about? And when Alídio in Mato Grosso in Brazil, when he started doing the studies of the books of Joana de Angelis, there are 16 books that around the psychology of the spirit, and he decided to start with self-awareness and then move on to the other virtues. He has talked already about many other different virtues or things that we're invited to change, such as guilt, such as fear, such as anxiety, improving our self-love and so on and so forth. But he chose to start with self-awareness. This was actually the very first one he did. And the reason being self-awareness is what motivates that reflection within us to find out more about ourselves, to find out more about where we are. Because it's by knowing what we should, what we're invited to improve, that we can then go and improve, right? But finding that out first is very important, which comes with that self-awareness. So Jesus once told us in John chapter 8, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And I opened the book, Our Daily Bread, today by chance, and happened to be on this chapter 51 called In Chains, and where Emmanuel ends that text with this. How Paul, even though he said he was in chains, he said that he was able to achieve freedom because he was after the truth. And that goes completely in line with what Jesus told us, right? Knowing the truth will set us free. And what truth, right? We usually talk about truth, but it's explaining a little bit of what that truth is. And Lydia brings us the idea of two truths. The first one being the divine truth, the one that we can see in the gospel of Jesus, the one that we can see in the Spiritist doctrine over here, and in many other books, Spiritist books. And the other one is the internal truth. It's the self-awareness that we go through to find out where we are, right? Trying to understand who we are without any personas or without any egoic masks, without the pretending who we think we are, who we pretend to be, and find out who we truly are. So it's trying to understand through this reflection where we are right now, which is our internal truth, so we can get to the divine truth, right? So we know where we want to be, we know where we currently are, and when we have these two, right, we can walk towards the divine truth. And I always bring this reflection because it makes a lot of sense to me. Again, why bother with our internal truth? Can we just, know the divine truth, know I want to go there and go there? Well, it's really important for us to understand what needs a little work within ourselves, right? That's why it's so important to know who we are. The analogy that I use is it's very simple, but I like cars, so I bring cars as an example, right? How can I fix a car if first I don't know about cars, I don't know how they work, and second, if I don't know what's wrong with them? So if I'm about to go fix a car, knowing how cars work would be knowing our divine truth, and then diving in and in that engine, in that car that I'm looking at, trying to find out what's wrong with it so I can fix it. Right? So finding out what's wrong with it, finding out the things that needs to be improved, that's finding our internal truth. Right? So knowing what's wrong and knowing how we should be, we can fix it. Right? And I can bring that to us, understanding the things that we're invited to work on, and knowing where we want to go, where we want to be, we can then work towards that direction. So that's a little bit on why self-awareness, why it's so important to know who we are, where we are. And it helps us a lot also with the golden rule, right? By knowing what we truly want that others do unto me, right? From an immortal spirit perspective, by truly knowing what I want done unto me, not to feed my pleasures, but to feed my immortal spirit, that will help me understand how to treat others, right? Because the golden rule talks about do unto others what you wish others would do unto you. So by truly knowing what I want others to do for myself, I can do that to others. So it's just very involving to talk about self-awareness, and it truly can help us. Now, I want to start with a passage from Joanna that talks from the book Self-Discovery, where she talks about the awakening of the conscience is a slow and continuous effort, which constitutes the challenge of our evolutionary process. So we're starting to talk about self-awareness, right, to the awakening of our conscience. So it's really important that we understand that this is not something that we'll learn like today, and tomorrow we'll be self-aware, right? It is a continuous effort. It is slow and continuous, right? It's here we're after the quality, not the quantity. And she says that by printing into our self, our internal self, God's laws, we can develop our conscience from the inside out, right? Driven by our will as our main existential purpose. So when we have the existential purpose to fulfill the divine laws, to live our lives by the divine laws, we can awaken our conscience, and that awakening will bring us this will to keep going, right? It's what Paul was talking about, feeling that freedom of reaching that or walking towards that truth, right? That freedom is very motivating, right? It instills that will within ourselves to keep going, to keep tracking through that path. And since we are talking about suffering, right, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about suffering, what is suffering. Also, we'll touch upon trials and expiations. So Joanna says that giving our sensitivity as humans also experience our purification through pain, which generates psychological, physical, and moral suffering, which propels our efforts towards renewal, the process towards plenitude. So there's a couple important points here. First one is that suffering leaves no window for doubt. When we're suffering, we usually know we are suffering because it is something that hurts a lot, something very, very uncomfortable. So there's no room for doubt. It's something that we truly feel it. What it isn't that clear is how we behave with it. Do we see it with abnegation, or do we behave with rebellion? Right? Do we rebel against that pain, or do we accept it and then try to understand why I have it and move forward? So that will be two different ways of seeing it, and we'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. But what Alidu brings here that makes can make a lot of sense, especially when we look at the Spirit's book, is he asks the question, why does God allow suffering to exist, right? And then he says that suffering can awaken within ourselves the will to free us from that pain with abnegation, right? Which can propel the development of the virtue, like Joanna talked about here, right? Propels our efforts towards renewal, right? We finally say, I can't rebel anymore. I'm invited to basically succumb, accept, and change myself. And Alidu also says that suffering is not inherent to life, but it is a result of how we lead our lives, right? That has a lot to do with the law of cause and effect, right? It doesn't mean that I have to suffer. Having a life doesn't mean that I have to suffer, but depending on how I lead my life, that will eventually or that might bring me to suffering. And this brings us to the question 120 in the Spirit's book, that very first one. When Kardec asked, do all spirits go through evil to get to being good? Right? Do we have to go through evil to become good? And then the Spirit's answer, going through evil? No. Going through the ignorance. Right? And in that ignorance, a lot of us choose to go onto an evil path. So the evil is not something necessary. It is something that we choose, and as a result, we might experience some pain and some suffering, but simply to help us understand what we did wrong and what to do next. So again, bringing us back to the idea of how do we see suffering, right? On earth here we can see that suffering exists in almost all of us, or it can at least. And there's two types of conscience that we'll talk a little bit about. In the previous talk we mentioned, I think it was 6 different types of conscience, the evolution of our conscience. Today we'll be talking mostly about 2, just lumping them together, just for the purpose of the explanation. So, when I'm still in the dormant conscience, the way I see suffering is from a very, from a rage, from a rebellion, from a revolt. I'm really mad at that suffering. And then if I'm very materialistic, I will try to find a very physical, a very scientific answer to what I'm feeling, and usually try to stop that pain with exterior means, right? Whereas if I'm not that materialistic, but if I believe in God, but it's still a very blind faith, it's still a very weak faith, and I undergo suffering, that's basically testing the faith that I have. And if it is fairly weak, then I might rebel against God, right? Or blame the suffering that I'm having on exterior things, like I'm obsessed, or I'm have bad luck, or it's so-and-so that made me feel this way, and so forth. So always, again, seeking for external means to show us why we're suffering. This is an dormant conscience, right? When I started to awaken my conscience, which is one of the main things about self-awareness, right, is to awaken our conscience. When we are there, we see suffering in a different way, right? We understand that it is an invitation for us to reflect, right? For us to understand why are we suffering, right? What should I do within myself to fix it, to overcome it? We understand it's something that comes from inside out, right? The suffering that I'm having right now is because of actions that I did in the past. So the healing, the fix, again, is from inside out, not from the outside in. And a lot of times we might rebel again against suffering, but it's always good to remind ourselves of our faith with God, right? Understanding that the only reason why God allows suffering is because we've already rebelled so much that He's trying to protect us by trying to invite us to realize that there's something there that needs some improvement, some fixing. So the awakened conscience can see suffering from a different perspective, right? And it can be a lot more bearable that way. So, like I said before, we will be touching upon expiation and trials and the differences and why we go through them. So to talk about expiation, the first thing we briefly are invited to mention is reincarnation, right? Reincarnation, as Joanna says. And by the way, all of these texts are from that first book that I mentioned in the very first slide, Seeking the Truth. And so reincarnation is an inevitable law of life, a means of superior quality for the development of the spirit. The spirit who is the architect of their moral and of their destiny. Right? So it is up to us to shape our morals and our destiny. Right? We go through many experiences through reincarnation, and in them we might suffer. And again, that's that invitation for repair. And Alidio says something that freeing ourselves from suffering can happen with a decision. Right? Because the suffering piece of it is how I see it. It's the suffering starts when I start to rebel against a pain that I'm feeling. So if I accept the divine laws instead of trying to fight them, instead of trying to rebel against them, I can end my suffering itself. The pain will likely still be there, as the pain takes quite a bit more time to overcome, to work with. But the suffering piece can be changed based on a decision, and on a decision that we make daily, on a very willful decision. And good morning, Carol. Glad to see you here. And then now we'll touch a little bit more about the expiation piece. So Jonah says that it is up to the spirit to apply corrections to their impulses to propel their advancement according to what they should and shouldn't do. Right? So again, she's telling us here that we are the owners, basically, of ourselves. Right? It's based on our decisions that we can shape our lives. Right? And she goes on to say that every time we make a mistake, on purpose or not, we repeat until we get it right. So that's what she calls it, a trial, or a test, or an ordeal, whichever English word you want to use, to the word provas in Portuguese. And like we say, Earth is a planet of trials and expiations. The trials here is this piece, right? And the trial, you can make the analogy of just like taking a test at school. Very simple analogy. How it's not painful. It's not necessarily painful. It's something that it's there to test us on whether or not we've learned something, right? And at the same time, the fact that we did well on the test doesn't necessarily mean that we won't make that mistake again, right? And again, a very simple analogy. I'm using very simple analogies here today. If we're talking about math, and when we're learning very simple math, for example, 2 + 2 is 4, right? Simple additions. We go through that first test, and if we pass it, we got the addition right. That doesn't mean that when I'm learning calculus or learning something a lot more complex, I won't make those simple sum or simple addition mistakes, right? So we can't get in, or we shouldn't get into the illusion that thinking that just because we've passed one test, we now know that and we'll never make that mistake again, right? That's why we have so many tests, and I'll end the presentation talking a little bit about the test of compassion that in this lifetime we're invited constantly to exercise. And then, since I talked a lot about trials, we can go further a little bit more and say that, and if we insist stubbornly on a mistake, we create pain for ourselves, and that's the expiation piece, right? It's when we make a mistake and we refuse to take that test, basically, and we just want to keep making that mistake. And eventually, as a way to protect us from ourselves, we start this process of feeling pain. And the reason why we brought this here is to understand trials, expiation, pain, and suffering. Right? How do they go about? So first of all, every expiation is a trial, but no trial is an expiation. Whenever we have the pain factor, if you will, we're entering the expiation. And where does suffering come into this? Suffering actually is us refusing or rebelling against that pain, and it's a state where we are going against the divine laws, right? We're refusing the divine laws. So when we think about suffering, when I'm suffering, I am not expiating. I guess this render a side note. What is expiation? Expiation means extracting the purity within ourselves, right? When we're going through that pain, we're being heavily invited to extract the virtue that will transform that pain, that mistake that I made, right? So the suffering, when I'm suffering, I'm not expiating, because suffering is a rebellion. Suffering is not reflecting and extracting that purity within myself, right? So a lot of times when I say, oh, that person is suffering a lot, he's expiating a lot, you know, that's not necessarily true, right? A person can suffer for many lives and still have that suffering coming back because they're not expiating, right? They're not extracting the lessons, the learnings, the purity that they're invited to extract in that situation. So once I stop rebelling against that pain and I succumb to it, I accept it, I abnegate myself towards it, then the suffering goes away. The pain, then I start working with the pain through my expiation. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense. Before this, I always got those confused, and this brought me some clarity of these words that we use so much, right? Trials, expiation, pain, suffering, and so on. So it was good to understand where they fit in. And the last reflection that Alito makes here is on the divine forgiveness. And if you were here, I would ask you, what do you think divine forgiveness is? Because we have a lag in technology, it'll take you a few seconds to see this question, so I'm not going to wait for an answer. But basically, but I do invite you to give comments on what you think divine forgiveness is. But Alito brings us the idea that divine forgiveness is the opportunity that God gives us to repair our mistakes. It's that second chance, the third, the fifth, the 10th, the 50th chance that he gives us to repair that mistake that we keep on making. And that propels progress, right? So here we have God's mercy propelling the law of repair, which propels the law of progress. So we can see many different laws intertwining in this idea, because if we think that God's forgiveness is annulling something that we did, that doesn't propel learning, right? That doesn't propel progress. But when we learn how to do it right, that propels progress. And then Jonah brings a bit of a side note when she's talking about suffering, and Alito brings this forward, and here we start. Oh yeah, sorry. This is from the book Seeking the Truth. The first book was Self-Discovery. My bad. And so here we'll start looking at the book Seeking the Truth, and she brings about this idea of victims and how I'm sure a lot of us do this, and how dangerous this could be. So she says that coming to our senses, in Portuguese that is cair em si, right? Coming to our senses should be the first step for everyone with a sick soul. Because those who delight themselves in the conflicts and refuse the blessings of the real health stay in the state of suffering, opting for pity and commiseration, or sympathy. In Portuguese, commiseração. Instead of the helping hand of love and fraternity. So this is when we start in this movement of self-pity, right? We start to seek pity from others. We start to seek sympathy from others, right? Getting into this victim state. And why is one of the reasons why this is very delicate is because this brings an illness to the spirit. Because when we are behaving as victims, we do not see us capable of making a change. We don't see the potential that we have to make a change, right? And when we don't see our potential, we don't see our strength, right? That starts to distance ourselves from us, starts to distance ourselves from the from feeling sons and daughters of God, and that can be a path that can lead to some more serious movements or states, such as depression and so on. And it is very common, this feeling of, or trying to victimize ourselves. So through self-awareness, we can, through those reflections that we do, we can try and identify, right? Am I playing the victim in any aspects of our lives, right? And again, the invitation is for us to do a reflection within us, not try to point fingers or try to find out that this cousin, that brother, that sister, that husband, that wife is playing victims, but the invitation again is the reflection upon ourselves. And so like we said, coming to our senses, right? Joanna talks a lot about coming to our senses, and so does Elidio. And it's a very beautiful passage from the book Seeking the Truth, when she says that winning our conscience starts with coming to our senses. So, cair em si in Portuguese. And thanks to the suffering we experienced, which is what unlocks the necessity of our awareness, our self-awareness. The conscious suffering, the one that sparks reflection, right, normally invites behavioral change because it expresses physical, emotional, and psychic imbalances. This evolutionary experience conducts with safety the encounter with our inner Christ, helping amplify our infinite possibilities for growth and freedom. And so this kind of sums up everything that we've been talking about. How the first on the first paragraph, when she talks about the necessity. So the necessity here is not the suffering. The necessity is our awareness, our self-awareness. Right? Suffering is never necessary. Right? We might end up there because of our actions, but it's never necessary for us to evolve. And then she says that the conscious suffering, right? So when we start to develop this conscience, right? We start to reflect, that sparks within us this reflection, and then we're able to see the imbalances that we have, why we have them, and what should we do to improve them. And then she ends with this evolutionary experience, right? This awakening of our conscience, this developing our virtues, conduct with safety the encounter with our inner Christ. Right? We are all Christs in potential, and by being all Christs in potential, that means that we have the potential. We have capacity. Like she said, we have infinite possibilities and strength to reach our growth and to reach our freedom, right? Like Emmanuel said in the book, how Paul was feeling free for seeking and walking with the truth. How Jesus told us that the truth will set us free. So again, this inner Christ just tells us that yes, we can, basically. And now we're starting to change a little bit our talk into the self-healing, into the spiritual healing that we can practice to help us resignify our pain and try to ease our suffering. And Alito brings two reflections that he makes on the side. He talks about the pursuit of happiness and our individual roles. So, the pursuit of happiness here is when most people are usually trying to achieve happiness, right? A lot of times we're still driven by our passions, by our superficial passions, but we're still looking for that happiness, right? We might not be taking the right way, the right approach, but we're still seeking for happiness, right? So a lot of times those might feel very selfish. I might go over people, right? I might do bad things to people just to achieve that happiness. So it comes from a good place, if you will, but the means are still not correct, right? And then I don't know if I have time for a quick analogy that I thought about happiness and pleasure. So, in this reflection that I have with my own self, I quite enjoy skydiving, and because I like the happiness that I feel when I have like a big and a nice view from the top, right? And so the reflection that I make with happiness is that the true happiness, right? The happiness for the internal, for the immortal spirit, is that happiness that it invites us to build, basically building blocks, right? So you build a block here. That's one step forward, right? It's one small virtue developed, and you keep building blocks and you keep building blocks. Every time you build a block, right, you step on it, and you can start to have a nice view from the top. Next block over, you can have a better view, and you can keep going and going. Eventually, you can get to the top and have this amazing view. With skydiving, again, a very simple analogy, but it's something that means something to me. With skydiving, I am wanting to have that view from the top, but without any work. Right? I'm trying to reach that euphoria feeling. It's not true happiness. It's more a euphoric feeling where I'm up there. I can have the view that I wanted, but it lasts 40 seconds, and then it's gone, and then I'm back on the ground. If I want that again, I have to hop on a plane and go towards it again. So it's not building anything. It's not building any base, right? When we're searching for that euphoria, it's only giving us the pleasure for a few seconds, a few days, a few months, whatever it is. But it's not building the basis that will help us reach that fulfilled happiness, if you will. So hopefully this made sense. It does make a lot of sense to me. I don't have much time to explain, but basically, it's a very rudimentary analogy between the euphoria or the happiness. And our individual roles that a leader brings is when he talks about what is our role within self-awareness. Our role within society, right, is to make ourselves better. Work with self-awareness to make ourselves better, and then maybe become an example to others. There's a big brackets here, or a big invitation of reflection. A lot of times we want to improve ourselves so we can be an example to others. for example, I want to change a person, so I'm going to try to improve myself and then rub it against them. Look, you should be doing this because this is what's good. Look at me now, right? So again, that's a very selfish and a very egoic feeling still, because the reason why I'm trying to improve is, again, to change others, right? Whereas the example that we give can be a consequence. It should never be the cause. It should never be the reason why we improve or we try to improve ourselves, right? We look at our own development because we love ourselves, right? Because we want to be closer to the truth. We want to reach that happiness. We want to have that freedom that the truth can bring us. And as a consequence, it might serve as an example to others, but any example is still subject to everybody's free will, right? They might take it, they might not. Look at Jesus, right? He is the best example that we have, and here we are, right? So we have the free will, right? We, I'm sure, I can speak for myself, chose many times not to, and still do, many times not to follow the virtuous path. So the idea of becoming an example to others, so others would change, again, it's fairly egoic. So that's a note that a leader brings for reflection. So now we're starting this spiritual health, and there's 4 things that Joanna talks about to bring this spiritual health, and it all revolves around love. And the first one, she says, considering all individuals worthy of being loved, and utilize as models someone that loves them as an example as to why they are worthy of love. So here, Joanna is bringing us things that we can exercise on others to help us ease our suffering, to help us develop our compassion. So, first of all, considering all people worthy of love. We are all sons and daughters of God. We're all immortal spirits. We are all worthy of love. If it is an enemy of ours, we likely won't love them like we love our family, but we certainly can exercise compassion towards them, right? Compassion being seeing them as worthy of loves, seeing them as immortal spirits, seeing them as with having the potential to become better, right? So seeing others as an immortal spirit, not as somebody that's driven by the ego. They might be at that point in time, but they have the potential not to be, and they will get there eventually, right? And then she talks about using somebody as an example. So if there is, for example, somebody that we have a hard time loving, or we have a hard time seeing as worthy of love, that person likely has someone that loves them, right? And if it is somebody close to us, we can look at that person and see, why does she love him, right? And try maybe to go that way, to try to instill this feeling of compassion within ourselves. Then the second one is when Joanna tells us to identify and motivate the traces of good in others' characters, right? So this goes back to the happiness that we talked about. Usually most people are trying to achieve happiness. It's just the way they go about it as it's not correct, right? So the motivation is right, but the way they get there might not, right? So identifying the traces of good in people, right? And trying to identify what they have within themselves and their actions that is good, right? And Alidio brings the idea that a lot of times we might think that it's a very naive feeling when we tell somebody, or when we think about we just have to, or we're invited to just see the good in people. A lot of times that might seem naive, right, or too innocent, right? But It isn't. Because this exercise of seeing the good in people is a great therapy for our own selves. Not only does it help us to exercise love towards that person, but it also helps us exercise love towards our own self. Right? It helps us be more welcoming. It helps us liberate ourselves from even that suffering, right? Trying to identify the things that we do that are good. And then moving to the third one, she talks about apply compassion when wronged. Right? So this brings us to that passage of the passage of Jesus of showing the other face, right? When he gets slapped on one cheek, show the other one. And here, the reflection that a leader brings is talking, it's not simply like to show the other cheek and go, okay, hate me now. It's by our reaction being the opposite of the one that we got, the one that we received, right? So if we received rage, right, we're going to react with compassion, right? That's the idea, the notion of the other cheek, right? It's doing the opposite. It's always going back with compassion, right? Seeing again that person as worthy of love, as an immortal spirit, as somebody who's trying, probably maybe not trying the right way, but they are looking for happiness, right? It might just be the way they're taking is not the correct one. So Eric brings us a comment saying, we usually have this mechanism of self-defense to blame situations and others. Rarely do we deeply reflect and find out our own responsibility to be living with pain and suffering. And the mechanism is an egotistic feeling to only serve the ego, and that's very, very relevant, right? Always looking for that external reason, because we're really sometimes too proud to see that we are the cause of that pain and that suffering. And it's where self-awareness can help us a lot, right? Trying to identify within ourselves what led us here. And one reflection I had this morning was self-awareness can certainly bring us to arrive sometimes at the reason why we're suffering. But the real question is not necessarily why, but what for. Right? So, okay, yeah, I'm suffering now. What am I invited to do next? Right? Instead of, because suffering can bring us to the victim state again and trying to just stew in the past, whereas the suffering is, and the pain are truly inviting us to realize, what should I do next? Right? What's next to bring me out of this? What's next to transform myself? And I have 3 more slides, and I have 3 minutes, so bear with me here. Now these are actually pretty quick. The 4th one, which is the last piece of advice from Joanna to talk about spiritual health, is love should be a constant in our existence, right? She says that love is the antidote, the most effective antidote against any evil. It is the most effective antidote, right? It changes the structure of any negative feeling that we might have within us, and it promotes good. And number 2 of this was talking about seeing the good in people, right? There's a text in the book Fonte Viva, Living Spring, number 31, that came in one of our evening prayers, and I do invite you all to read it. But this is what Joanna tells us about seeing the good. She says the act of seeing the good in people becomes a preventive therapeutic habit in relation to the aggressions around us, constituting the courage to deliberate and fight. Right? What a beautiful passage to encourage us to see the good in people, to see the good in us. Right? It's very therapeutic for ourselves and for society. Right? Especially with all the aggressions around us, and especially, I guess, in the past years when we're bombarded with news, especially bad news. And we can see that as those tests, those trials that we were talking about, right? And every time we open the news, we're invited to what? To exercise compassion towards them, right? There is there's a phrase attributed to Aristotle that talks about resentment it's a toxin that I drink expecting others to die, right? So the resentment that we keep towards people is doing most harm to our own selves, right? And I want to end with a couple passages on the power of love that Joanna brings us in that same book, where she says, love reveals in the instinct and prevails during the period of reason, which is then responsible for reaching plenitude, right? So when we first became spirits with a capital S, if you will, right? Love was already there. It reveals itself in the instinct. And then that's where it reveals itself. Then it prevails in the period of reason, right? When we're awakening our conscience. And then it's the one main driver towards our plenitude. It instills peace and irradiates trust, promotes nonviolence and establishes fraternity, that unites and sympathizes men and women amongst all, canceling our distances and our suspicions. And lastly, it is the most powerful link that we have with, she calls it the generating cause of life, with God. Right? It is the motor that conducts the good action while stimulating patience. So hopefully the invitation today is for compassion, for love, finding the good in people. And we can use that as a test and see how much that has an effect on easing our own suffering, our own pain. So thank you again for watching. It's a very loving invitation to practice some love today. And thank you all for participating. Thank you, Sonia, Eric, Carol, Renata, for being here today. It's always good to see your faces. And I hope you have a great Sunday. And we'll see each other again tomorrow at 7 p.m. at our public meeting in Portuguese. So hope to see you all there. And I'm just going to do a quick prayer just to end our talk. So let us close our eyes. And think about Jesus. Think about the love of Jesus. Think about the way that he looked at people. Think about his ability to see the good in people. Think about his ability of seeing people as worthy of love, as immortal spirit, as sons and daughters of God. Jesus, help us include ourselves in that reflection. Help us see us as worthy of love. Help us see us as having good traits, as having good actions. Help us in our constant exercise of compassion. And may we use your example of love as our guiding force, so that in every step that we take, in every look that we make, in every smile that we open, may we bring a little bit of love to it all. So be it. Thank you all again, and hope to see you all again tomorrow at 7 p.m. Have a great Sunday, and see you later.